They showed up at sunrise with a clipboard and a fake badge to tell me I had to vacate my own land. By noon, they'd brought a skid steer to my fence and a chain for my gate. This is what happens when an HOA decides your mountain cabin doesn't fit their aesthetic. And it all ended with a judge's gavel and a lesson they won't forget. Get off my porch. Those were the first words out of my mouth when two so-called HOA agents showed up before sunrise, acting like they had a badge that meant something real. They walked straight through the frost like they owned the place, holding papers that shook in their own hands. The gall of it nearly made me laugh, but the kind of laugh you choke on because you're this close to losing your cool. My dog knew before I did that something ugly was coming, his ears flat, tail stiff, and trust me, it wasn't the weather. They came up the ridge at sunrise like they owned the hill. Boots chewing gravel, radios chirping like nervous birds that did not know the spally. Two men, fresh haircuts, matching jackets with a stitched crest that looked official from far away and cheap up close. One held a clipboard like a shield, the other filmed with a phone. He read a notice about emergency access and community review. I said the word review out loud and asked who gave them keys to my life. The man with the phone said they were HOA field agents and that my occupancy would be evaluated. He said it smooth, as if repeating a script learned last night. I asked which law let a neighborhood committee seize a cabin on county land. The clipboard lifted higher like it could block common sense. He replied, "We like things consistent here." And the phrase slid across my porch like oil on water. My jaw tightened. I told them to show proper authority or step back. They did not step back. The filmer zoomed on my door as if the wood itself was criminal. The other man waved a plastic badge that caught a beam of thin light and gleamed like a toy. He said they could post an order and I would have to vacate. I asked for a judge's signature. He tried a smile and said the board chair signed. I laughed. It came out sharp. Birds startled from the firs. I kept my last study because I did not want my hands to shake. He declared I was out of compliance for noise, storage, and visual harmony. I looked at my stacked firewood, level and neat, and at the metal toolbox that belonged to my father, and at the blue enamel kettle sitting on the rail, warm from the early stove. I asked if the kettle offended the council's eyes. He jotted a note. The other man muttered, "Not a good cultural fit." Soft, but clear, and heat climbed my neck. I chose one breath, then another. Then I opened the door. Inside, the cabin held the cold like a kept secret. I set my palm on the rack and felt the smooth stock of the shotgun that had hung there my whole life. It was my father's and my grandfather's before him. Polished each fall, carried on long walks where nothing needed shooting. I lifted it out. No rush, no theatrics. The action clicked in a sound that had gravity. I stepped back onto the threshold with the gun resting across my forearms like a simple fact. Their eyes said everything. The filmer's hands shook and the phone dipped. The clipboard man tried to square his shoulders, but one knee trembled and gravel slid out from his boot tread. I did not point the barrel. I did not need to. I told them they were on private land and that I was peacefully asserting my rights. The radio squawked with someone asking for an update. He could not answer. His lips worked. No sound. Wind moved the pines with a long breath like the mountain itself was watching. The filmer blurted that this was intimidation and that they would call county. I said, "Please do. I like county. County knows where the line sits on a real map." He barked that I was obstructing official business. I asked him to define official. He glanced at the crest on his sleeve. He read the words as if that would conjure power. I said the crest was embroidery and the badge was plastic. He said I would lose access. I asked access to what? He did not know how to answer. Clipboard tried a new tack and announced an inspection for safety, wildfire risk, and neighborhood character. He circled the stacked logs again as if wood could start a fire by being wood. I told him I kept a clear ring, metal roof, screened vents, and water barrels tucked where sparks cannot find them. He wrote another line. He said my fence looked too frontier for the area. I said the area was forest. He marked a box. I asked who trained him to mark boxes that fast. He posted the paper to my door with blue tape like he was crowning himself. The heading said courtesy notice in thick font, and the body listed penalties that grew like weeds from a sidewalk crack. He tapped the paper with 2 fingers as if tapping could make it legal. I said courtesy should start with a knock and an appointment. He muttered that my tone was aggressive. I looked at the shotgun against my forearms and said my tone was calm and my boundaries clear. They took a step back, then faked forward. Their courage worked in stutters. The filmer tried to reclaim the moment by narrating into his mic about a resident refusing access. He called me resident as if I had wandered in by mistake. I said owner. He said member. I said not of your board. He said our community needs unity. I said unity is not your leash. He panned past the ridge as if to gather witnesses from the trees, then cursed when his phone flashed low storage. Radio static popped. A tiny voice asked if the subject was compliant. The filmer lied and said partially. Clipboard said he was escalating. I told him to be careful with that word. He puffed out his chest and announced enforcement. I asked what that meant. He said fees, then liens, then contractor access. He glanced at my door again like a hired crew might kick it soon. My stomach tightened. I pictured strangers in my pantry counting jars like evidence. I caught the thought and set it down. I eased the shotgun to the door frame and leaned it there, vertical, steel, quiet. I did not want my temper to be their excuse. I told them they were free to leave by the same path they arrived and that I would call the sheriff myself to document the visit. They smirked at sheriff like it was a game. I described the parcels and the coordinate markers in plain words and said the county line was honest, even when people were not. The filmer swallowed and looked at his shoes. They edged to their SUV. A dull gray thing with HA decals slapped crooked on both doors. The tires were bald. The roof rack rattled when the wind found it. Clipboard tried a last speech about harmony and consistency. He said change endangers values. I told him integrity protects value. He frowned like the word hurt. He said they would be back with support. I said bring people who wear real badges in daylight. The engine struggled twice before catching, loud and rough in the quiet. They rolled down the hill and left dust hanging between the fur trunks like threadbare curtains. You think that would be enough? That they'd see the gun, the conviction, and just back down? No, this wasn't about safety. This was about control. And they were just getting started. I stood there with my palm on the doorframe and let my breath settle. My dog crept out from under the porch, old hips stiff, and pressed his head against my knee. I told him we had done nothing wrong. His tail moved once like a nod. I stared at the blue tape on the notice and the font that tried to look like law. The paper fluttered like a moth that could not find its way home. I called the county line and logged a report. The dispatcher knew my parcel and knew the long argument between the board and the people who live near the timber. She said a deputy could swing by later and that I should photograph the notice. I thanked her and set the phone down. I took pictures of the tape, the stamp, the misspelled words that showed the rush. I saved them to a folder named Ridge Morning. I do that on days when trouble tries to write its own story. I walked the boundary while the coffee cooled. Frost still held the shaded grass and crunched light under my boots. I checked the posts and the orange tags, then the small plaque my father bolted to the gate when I first moved back. It says this place is kept, not abandoned. A jay screamed at me from the alder like I was late to something. Maybe I was late to learning that a friendly smile at a meeting is not the same as a handshake with honor. Footprints marked the side trail where they had gotten cute and cut through brush to film the cabin from another angle. I followed the prints to a stump where candy wrappers crinkled under a rock. The view from there frames my kitchen window like a stage. I felt the hot throb behind my eyes that comes when a line gets crossed in daylight. I told myself study. I whispered it. Study like an oath. Then I heard a second engine below the bend. Deeper, heavier. Not the same SUV. For a breath, the forest went still like the ridge took a pause before speaking again. The second engine came slow and heavy, idling at the bend. Then the gray SUV reappeared with a white pickup behind it. The bed held cones, folding tables, and a banner rolled with bungees. They parked across my trailhead like they were blocking a parade. I felt the ridge stiffen. My dog stood at my knee and watched. I told myself, breathe and count to 3. Trouble likes a show. So what do they do when intimidation fails? They bring a parade. A full-blown performance for the neighbors, complete with a banner and a megaphone. They brought one. They staged it quick. Neighbors shuffled onto gravel. The banner stretched between poles and read Community Unity Meeting. The voices too rehearsed for real talk. A woman in a dark blazer lifted a megaphone toward the small crowd of residents. She spoke about community authority and shared bylaws. Words hollow but loud online. I waited on the porch, hands open, listening for the moment when real law might appear. It never came. She announced a neighborhood review and introduced her HOA agents, the same two who had failed at dawn. They looked past me as if the cabin were scenery, and I was a stubborn actor. She said, "Our HOA community values unity near the forest edge." I said from the porch, "You do not own this ridge." Heads turned. She smiled like a teacher caught by a student and gripped the megaphone harder. They started with gestures. One agent pointed his phone at my stacked wood. The other waved a clipboard toward my chimney and called it a violation for the live stream. I asked for the code section. He coughed and wrote a number to look busy. The blazer woman praised their performance. She never said deputy or county or inspector. She said team. That word can hide a lot. Neighbors stood behind the phones. One asked if this was an actual order, and she thanked him for supporting shared values without answering. I stepped to the rail and raised my phone. I said I was documenting a staged broadcast on private land. The filmer raised his radio and whispered something that did not sound like a plan. The other walked to my gate to wave a laminated sheet. The sheet said community resolution in a font that wanted to be official. It listed hearings, dates, and a demand for access. I read it and said there is no judge name, no statute, no county seal. The blazer woman hurried in with talk of community authority. I asked for the deed map. She said that is administrative. I said boundaries are not a mood. A neighbor choked a laugh, then coughed. The agent glared like a cough could be fined. They tried a new angle. The pickup driver rolled a small skid steer off the trailer and parked near my split rail fence. He said they would remove combustible materials within the interface. He tapped my wood pile and pointed at the old propane tank. I said, "Do not touch my property." He said the board could authorize temporary removal. I said theft has another name in this county. The machine idled a low growl. My dog sat and did not blink. I called the county line on speaker. The dispatcher knew my parcel and asked if outside agents were claiming authority. I said they were staging an inspection and pushing removal. She told me to stay calm, document, and expect a deputy. She asked if anyone had sworn credentials. I said no. She said, "Thank you and keep recording." The blazer woman smiled like the word county meant nothing. It meant everything to me. They shifted to moral theater. She spoke about neighborhood character and how frontier aesthetics destabilize values. I felt the word frontier land on my porch like a stone. I said, "My fence keeps elk out and my stove keeps me warm." She nodded as if humoring a child and announced a temporary chain for my gate. The agent produced a tin-coiled padlock. I said, "Do not." He lifted the chain and the links rattled like cold rain. They brought out more paper, a temporary evacuation order on board letterhead with a bold mirror-trained signature. I read it aloud so the neighbors could hear and asked where the judge was. The blazer woman said, "The board can act for harmony." I said, "Harmony is not an emergency power." She raised the megaphone as if it could be won. The skid steer rolled forward half a length. The bucket kissed my rail and pressed a faint creak from the wood. The agent kept his eyes on me, not the line painted near the survey pin. I pointed at the pin and recited the parcel description from memory. The words felt like a spell. He paused. The engine purred. My heart beat slow and heavy. I held ground. A neighbor asked if any of them were law enforcement. The blazer woman said they were community leadership. I said he asked for law. She ignored me and announced that assets could be removed for safe storage. I said, "Say that again into my recording." The wind lifted the banner so it fluttered like a fish trying to breathe air. The skid steer raised the bucket and waited. I started my counter. I set a trail camera on the porch post and turned the lens to the gate. I pinned a sign beside the notice that read, "No inspection without a warrant." I opened a spiral notebook and wrote times, names, and words spoken. I asked the blazer woman to spell her name. She did, then asked why. I said, because you brought a stage to my yard and called it policy. Radio static whispered. A tin voice asked for status, and the filmer said the subject was still non-compliant. The words hit like grit. The skid steer nudged the rail again. The wood groaned. My dog stood and took one step. Not a bark, just a line drawn by an old animal who knows territory. I said, stop. The driver hesitated and looked past the blazer toward the trees as if for permission from something older than a board. Then the sound I had been waiting for came thin through the valley. A siren nobody here confuses with theater. The blazer woman kept speaking about unity and safety, trying not to hear it. The neighbors heard, heads turned downhill. The agents took 2 steps back. The skid steer coughed and went still. My hands were steady. My breath was slow. I let the siren grow. They tried to reframe. She announced they were closing the inspection due to resident hostility and would resume with proper support. I said you should have started with lawful support. She said we chose escalation by not cooperating. I said cooperation is not surrender. A paper lifted and plastered against the cones in a gust like the ridge itself had signed a different notice. The 2 neighbors said nothing. Silence can be a vote. I could not see the lights yet, but the sound bent around the alder and wrapped the trail like a rope pulling weight. Purpose sat steady behind my ribs. The blazer woman squared her shoulders toward the bend. The agents tightened their jaws. The driver killed the engine. Somewhere a crow called a single harsh note that snapped and faded. The siren cut out as the vehicle reached the last turn, and for a breath, the ridge went perfectly still. Every branch and every eye waiting for the first true badge to speak. The siren died at the bend and a county SUV slid into view. Lights off, engine low, gravel popping under steady tires. I stood on the porch with my dog at my knee and the blazer woman held a fixed smile. The agent straightened, neighbors edged past the cones. I breathed once, then again, because this part had to be calm or nothing would hold. The deputy stepped out and the ridge exhaled. A real badge caught morning light in a way plastic never does. He asked names first, slow and measured. The agents handed laminated cards with quick fingers. He had the chain near my gate and asked who placed it. The driver lifted a hand halfway and dropped it. The blazer said temporary safety protocol. He asked under what code. She said community standards. He did not blink. He walked to my porch and asked me to tell it straight. I did. I kept my voice even and gave times, words, and actions. I handed him the courtesy notice and the evacuation paper with the bold signature. He read both, then asked if there was any warrant, any order, any county seal. I said none. He nodded. He said these were not enforceable. He asked if I wished to trespass them. I said document first. He radioed dispatch with names, plates, and a civil standby request. He logged the chain as attempted interference at my gate and told the driver to move the skid steer off my fence. The machine whined back to the trailer. He told the HOA agents that board authority is civil, not criminal, and property seizures require lawful process. Impersonation of a public officer is another matter. The filmer paled. The blazer tried new language. She said the HOA board had declared an administrative emergency about neighborhood character. The deputy asked again for code. She named a handbook section. He said that was not law. She thanked him for partnering with leadership. He said he was not her partner. He wrote a case number on my copy and told me to photograph it beside the posted sheet. I set the page on the rail and took clear photos, wide and tight on the number. I had both a trespass code sign and a no inspection without a warrant sign in the shed, so I fetched them and screwed them to the gate post by a shoulder lamp. One agent offered a compromise, vacate voluntarily while they assessed combustibles. The deputy said no. He asked for permits authorizing machinery or entry. None. He photographed the skid steer plate and asked for the operator's license. The driver produced a card that shook. The deputy studied it and handed it back. She said the community feared frontier aesthetics. He said fear is not a jurisdiction. Neighbors stared at their shoes, then at me. He finished, then spoke like a man who had stood in this posture before. People who play at power often come back sideways. Keep cameras rolling. Keep your log. Call if anyone steps on your porch with tools or lock hardware. He walked them to their vehicles with a calm that made retreat look like a choice. The agents did not meet my eyes. The driver loaded the machine with stuttering hands. The blazer moved her lips around a speech nobody heard. The neighbors drifted off like fog lifting from a creek. The cones clacked into the bed. Before he left, the deputy asked to see my boundary pins. We walked the line while my dog trotted ahead. He nodded at the tags and brass caps, paced the run, snapped photos, and said, "Maps argue until ground answers." At the gate, he paused. "This will get louder before it quiets. Keep your voice level and your hands open." He touched the posted code and left. The ridge swallowed his engine and the hush returned. I set new batteries in the porch camera, checked the trail cam angle, and laid a pencil beside my notebook. I wrote the time, the case number, and a line that read, "Deputy witnessed attempted chain." I printed 2 copies of a trespass notice with the parcel description. One went to a sleeve on the gate, one under the coffee tin. Afternoon thinned. I set a small chime on the back path, just a soft ring when a boot hits moss. I moved tools off the rail, coiled the hose, shut the generator house, and cleared a ring around the shed. Every small act felt like stacking sandbags against a flood I could not yet see. A murmur floated from the bend. I could not make out words, only rhythm. The wind carried a strand that sounded like contractor access after dark. Maybe I heard wrong, maybe not. I felt that crawl at the base of my neck. Steady, I told myself. I fed the stove and swept the threshold. My dog watched the last light drain. I called the dispatchers and asked if the report had posted. She said the number was live and I could request a copy in the morning. She logged a drive-through for late evening and offered a welfare check if trucks appeared on my cameras. I said yes. I set my phone volume high beside the window latch near the chair where my father once fell asleep reading maps. Dusk folded the ridge into fewer colors. I killed the porch lanterns to turn the glass dark. Headlights show clearer that way. I sat with the shotgun in its place and the notebook open. The first coyote talk came from the far draw. A branch snapped in the timber that was not coyote light. My dog's ears lifted, but he did not growl. I listened and the night listened back. The power in the cabin dipped and came back. A quick blink like someone testing where the line feeds through the brush. The lights blinked again after full dark. Just a tiny dip like a cough in the throat of the line. I set the mug down and walked to the window with my palm on the frame to keep my pulse even. The stove ticked as new would cut flame. My dog lifted his head and stared at the back path where the chime hung like a small witness. I waited without moving. Waiting is work in a place that keeps old secrets and remembers who listens. A low engine rolled into the valley like a drum covered in blankets. It idled a long time without lights, then clicked off. Silence pressed the porch glass flat. My dog stood. I killed the lamp inside so the room became a mirror and my eyes switched to the dark. Footsteps drifted slow and careful along the fence where moss deadened sound. A man cleared his throat and swallowed it. A faint word joined the air and a light dot jittered across the wall before freezing like a bead of blood. I opened the door and stepped into the cold with the phone already set to record. I left the shotgun resting against the table because a camera can be louder when the law is near. The stars were clean enough to outline hats and shoulders down by the shed. A drone dipped once above the alder, then steadied, its rotor a nervous hum. I said, "I am documenting a trespass on private land." Gravel answered like teeth under a shoe. One man muttered, "Check the fence." Another said, "Cut the feed." They wore jackets without logos, the kind sold by the dozen in a hardware aisle. One carried bolt cutters with red grips. The other pointed the drone's light into my yard, a shaky beam like a nervous eye. The beam glowed pale against the wood and showed scuffs that looked new. I said, "Do not touch my property." The cutter glanced up. He saw the phone, not my face. He tried a neighborly tone that sounded secondhand and asked if I needed help with compliance. I said, "Help is not a chain on my gate at noon and a drone at midnight." He murmured that the board had scheduled a temporary safety sweep. I said, "Show me the deputy." He set the cutters on the stump. His partner tapped the drone to circle closer, low and quiet, hoping I would flinch. I stepped closer until the lens caught the whole machine. Its red eye flickered like it had practiced intimidation in a mirror. I read the buzzing out loud. It was copied from a toy store catalog with stickers swapped by a bored hand. There was no county seal, no warrant, just an LED meant to look like law. I said, "You have the right to leave without me calling a deputy." The cutter said, "Nobody needs a deputy when neighbors are solving problems." He tried a smile. The smile stuck to the dark and would not hold. He pointed at the shed and said they would secure the tank and trim the brush. He said he could schedule a contractor to remove the wood ring. I said the tank is empty and tagged. The brush is my garden fence and the ring is code clear. He glanced at the drone again like it gave courage. The partner stood by the meter post with a flashlight like a stagehand waiting for a cue. I tilted the phone so the beam caught his face. He turned away and scratched his ear hard. The road coughed at the bend. I heard tires on wet gravel and the aftertaste of a siren somewhere near a mile out. Maybe it was another unit. Maybe it was an ambulance far down the valley heading the other way. The men heard it too. The cutter lifted the bolt tool by habit. The other pushed the drone higher like it suddenly needed cover. I said, "I have your faces, the tool, and the footage, and I am sending the clip to dispatch now." A shadow shifted near the alder where someone else had crouched. I spoke into the phone for the record and gave a time, a parcel, and a description. I said, "Trespass suspected, attempt to cut chain, unauthorized presence with aerial device." My voice sounded level in my own ears, and that helped. The cutter took 2 steps back and tried a new line. He said the board would file a non-cooperation report. I said, "File a sunrise and file a sunset." He blinked at the phrases like they came from a different county. They started to retreat with care, trying not to be seen retreating. The drone scraped a branch and spun once, leaving a thin line of dust as it settled. I walked alongside them, but kept space, camera up, recording every move. At the gate, he paused long enough to wave the machine toward the courtesy sleeve where my trespass notice sat. He smiled again, this time a real one, the kind a man uses after he drops a match. He said, "This one is official." I said the sleeve is for documentation, not tricks. When they cleared the fence, I closed my gate and set a new lock through the staple where their chain had clinked. I photographed the fresh marks on the post and the scuff on the latch plate. I took a clear shot of the sleeve and the broken rotor before I pulled it out. It was a cheap toy stamped with a brand that matched a box I had seen in the SUV earlier. The name sat like a thumbprint pulled from the morning spectacle on the gravel, a family name from a blazer tag. I walked back to the porch and dialed the deputy cell he had written on the case copy. He answered on the second ring and sounded like the kind of tired that still remembers duty. I told him what had happened, the drone, the tools, the coil, the words. He said, "Keep the men off the property. Do not touch the wreck and hold the video for his report." He said he was 2 ridges out and wrapping another call. He said he would swing my way. I turned the porch light on and left it blazing. Some nights you leave the lamp and let it declare your lines. I set the shotgun standing in the corner and plugged the phone to keep the battery from shivering. My dog pressed his back to my boot for a long minute like he was sorting the noise on the air. I replayed the footage twice, then a third time, and saw the small mistake men make when they rush to look official. They aimed the light wrong where the county never misses. I pulled my notebook and wrote a line I wanted to remember. It said the quickest way to lose a fight up here is to get mad when a camera can do the job. I took a slow breath and thought about the drone and where it would have flown if they had had time. The path to the meter makes a lazy turn past the alder where the third shadow had crouched. I walked that path and shined a light on the moss. 3 boots had made a shallow triangle where men plan with their feet. The wind thinned and I could hear the ridge the way you hear a house settle when everyone else has gone to bed. A small sound flicked from the far side of the shed. Not twig break, not animal quick, just the squeak of a hinge that had not moved in a long time. I moved the beam across the latch and saw fresh rub marks bright as new coin and a smear of dark grease where no grease lives on my hardware. I photographed the plate, then the screws, then the gap where a glove thread clung like a tiny flag. I swept the ground. 3 boot prints overlapped where someone had shifted weight and watched my porch. The tread was a block pattern with a missing corner on the right heel. I measured with my pocket tape and wrote the length in the notebook, then shot a close frame with the scale edge in view. The dirt breathed cold out of the crack and carried the smell of old apples and wet boards. My father once called that smell storm shelter. Tonight it smelled like a plan. I tied a thin bell cord between 2 nails at knee height on the back steps. Nothing sharp, nothing tricky, just a sound that says a line was crossed. My dog settled with his chest against the jamb, head up, tail still, the posture of an old guard who has seen gates tested before. I circled the shed once and found where the drone had clipped moss and left a faint arc that ended at the meter post. A stub of a cigarette lay near the alder, filter torn, no logo, and a sliver of zip tie wrapper had blown into the sword ferns. I bagged both in a sandwich bag from the drawer inside and wrote the minute on a strip of tape. The chime on the back path gave a nervous tremor and then went quiet, as if the air itself had hushed to listen. The beam swung back to the cellar seam, and the hinge whispered again, smaller than before, like breath drawn through teeth in a room that does not like strangers. Morning cracked cold and bright across the ridge. The rails stitched with frost, and the kettle ghosting a slow ribbon of steam that smelled faintly like iron. I walked the yard with my notebook open and traced last night's prints until the sun blurred their edges into gray smudges. The cellar hinge held. The new lock sat clean, and the forged permit lay sealed in a plastic sleeve on my table. Quiet isn't safety. Quiet is the breath you take before someone tries the door again. The parade returned before noon with more noise than reason, as if they wanted spectacle instead of dialogue. A flatbed rolled up carrying a stack of folding banners, boxes of glossy flyers, and a plastic podium dressed to look official. Behind it came a pickup packed with cones, folding chairs, and a loudspeaker that squealed even before it stood upright. They blocked my trailhead as if reserving an arena. The banner unfurled between 2 poles, bold letters shouting, "Neighborhood Standards Fair." As though ink alone could crown authority, the blazer woman took center with her megaphone and a smile rehearsed for cameras. She welcomed the neighbors to what she called an educational clinic, thanked the board for decisive action, and promised a live discussion of my so-called violations. She said, "Community leadership demands cooperation and harmony." I said, "Harmony starts with a warrant." Her smile thinned, but she clutched the microphone tighter. 2 agents dragged boxes of flyers to my gate like ushers setting up a rally, while the filmer swept his lens across the crowd for drama. They pinned pamphlets on the fence rails and stacked handouts on the table, each page stamped with my name in bold letters and claims of danger, then stepped back to photograph their own display. I filmed every move and read the case number into my mic, because records breathe stronger when spoken. The filmer tried to block my lens with his clipboard. I told him to enjoy the spotlight because courtrooms burn brighter. He called me disruptive. I said slander dressed as outreach is worse. A neighbor looked at his shoes and stayed silent. I pulled on gloves and removed the straw in slow, steady strokes, narrating each piece I lifted so the record would breathe. The blazer woman shouted that I was disrupting an inspection. I said, "You brought the hazard, and I am taking it away." An agent planted his boot on the bale like a child claiming a hill in a picture book. I moved the bale anyway and set it in the road where their flatbed would have to run it over to preserve the lie. At my gate, the gray tried a chain again. A man I didn't recognize hopped out with a padlock in one hand and a roll of caution tape in the other. He said temporary closure for public safety and reached for my post. I raised the bolt cutters, cited the case number, and told him locking a gate is criminal. He watched the camera find his face, let the chain drop, and pretended tape was gentler than steel. Tape looks friendly. It still means stay out. A new driver eased the skid steer forward like an apology on wheels. He feathered the bucket toward my wood pile as if touching slowly made touching lawful. I pointed to the brass cap in the soil and recited the parcel line. He paused half a beat and pressed again. The bucket grazed the rail and left a bright scrape like a fresh bruise across a shin. I said, "Stop. That is damage." He backed a foot and let the engine purr, A mechanical shrug that wouldn't fix the mark. The blazer woman slid a single sheet across the folding table with the care of someone handling inheritance. Emergency abatement invoice. It read with an hourly rate, a disposal fee, and a signature line labeled resident consent. She said, "Sign here so we can move quickly." I said, "I will sign the back of a maple leaf before I sign that." A neighbor snorted, then tried to turn the sound into a cough. An agent wrote my answer like ink could tame a refusal. I called County Fire Prevention on speaker and described the scene in plain words. No spice, no heat. The duty officer asked if foreign fuel had been placed against structures. I said yes and gave timestamps. He asked about ignition sources. I said the chipper's exhaust was hot and a red gas can sat under the table where hands would reach later. He told me to hold perimeter and said a unit was en route for a hazard check. The blazer woman smiled at trees instead of me. The county SUV rolled in with a small engine company behind it. Red truck clean, but not pretty. A lieutenant stepped down, shook my hand, read the case number off my copy, and asked to see the fuel. I pointed to the fence and the shed. He pinched straw between two fingers like a teacher holds gum pulled from under a desk. He asked who placed this. I spread my palm toward the banner. He nodded once, then turned and asked the crew to keep the chipper cold. He walked the fence line, checked the vents and the clear ring I maintain, and wrote fast in a notebook that had seen rain. He told the group that staging combustibles is not mitigation and that photographs of props don't equal fire science. He asked who brought the pallets of lins. The flatbed driver said, "I was told." The lieutenant asked by whom. The driver stared at the blazer's shoes like they might confess. The lieutenant said, "Pack your props and free the road." The blazer woman pivoted, waving a service disconnect request like a flag nobody salutes. I photographed the header and read the contractor name aloud. It matched last night's carbon copy. I called the company on speaker and asked for dispatch. A tired voice said no crews were assigned to my parcel and that their letterhead had been misused in 2 other neighborhoods. The neighbors' faces changed. The lieutenant wrote the statement and asked for the forged permit. I handed him the sleeve from my table. He studied the seal and the comma the county never misses, then looked up and said, "This is not a permit." The blazer woman said there had been confusion. He said there had been choices. One agent whispered that the board would bill me for delays. I said, "Invoice me so I can attach it to the case under fraud." He said I was being difficult. I said, "The ridge taught me. Some teachers are trees and some lessons take years." The crew cleared straw and brittle lins, measured the scrape in my rail, and photographed the bucket edge that made it. The lieutenant handed me a copy of his notes with a line that read foreign fuel, staged by non-authority removed. He asked if I wanted damage noted as well. I said yes. He measured with my tape while I held the end flat, and he said, "Documentation is the cleanest water in a dirty ditch." I believed him because the ditch around here has history. Neighbors lingered at the cone line, trying to look casual while their eyes did math. A woman I didn't know gave me a tight nod that felt like an apology. The blazer woman folded the banner with seal and slid it into a tube as if she could rewind the day. The chipper sat unhitched like a dog avoided for biting. The flatbed coughed, then found its idol. The filmer kept his lens down, suddenly in love with gravel. Performance wilts when witnesses stand their ground. A courier on a dusty bike coasted up the bend with a manila envelope and a hat that remembered rain. He checked my name twice and handed me the packet. Inside was a letter from an attorney I hadn't met, heavy with threat and light on law. It accused me of obstructing abatement and warned of liens. It quoted statutes that belonged to a different state. I read the header twice and felt the crawl return to my neck like a cold hand on warm skin. I photographed every page and texted the set to the deputy with a line that said, "New counsel, old script." I printed a copy for the folder and wrote the time next to the scrape measurement. The courier had vanished like a sensible man. The lieutenant closed his notebook and said he'd file by evening. He shook my hand and told me, "People mistake performance for compliance all the time. Theater ends when a witness speaks." He looked at me like he expected me to keep talking. When they finally cleared the road, the ridge took a breath you could feel through your soles. I coiled the hose, reset the chocks, and slid the bolt on the cellar door until the latch kissed home. My dog drank inside the way old dogs do when a shift ends. I knew the script would try again tonight. I set a battery pack by the window, checked the spare generator, and listened to the line hum like a wire drawn tight between posts that don't move for weather. The lights went out a minute later. Not a blink, a hard drop that made the stove tick, and the dark learned my name while something heavy moved on the path beyond the porch. The blackout landed like a heavy coat, and the ridge held its breath. I stayed still and let the silence speak first. The bell wire on the back steps trembled once, then went quiet like a finger pressed to someone's lips. I reached for the generator key, not the shotgun. Power keeps cameras honest. Noise only feeds pride. The stove clicked as it cooled. My dog watched the door with the patience of age. I told him easy and meant it. The generator caught on the third pull and rumbled into a steady thrum that felt like a pulse I could lean against. The porch cam blinked alive. The trail lens went green. I walked the line with my headlamp low so glare would not blind the glass. At the meter post, the lock hung twisted. Fresh scuffs brightened the beam, the kind of mark left by hurried tools. I photographed hinge, lip, ground, and wrote the time in my log. The deputy texted, asked if anyone official had scheduled work. I sent back, no, only intruders. He replied, keep recording. Fuel up. Do not touch the box. Headlights climbed the lower bend, then a pickup with a rented lift eased in. Not marked, not official. Two men in cheap vests checked a clipboard, looked at the cabinet, and frowned when they saw my camera fixed on them. One asked if I had requested disconnect. I said, not me and not county. He said, then we hurry tonight. They dragged out bolt cutters and a coil of tape, muttering about temporary closure. They looked like the same men from earlier, only swapping jackets and props. I kept the camera high, and within minutes, county lights swung up the grade. The supervisor's SUV braked, deputy behind her. She stepped out, badge glinting, and asked the men for work orders. They had none. She read their names into her recorder, cited unauthorized tampering, and tagged the cabinet with her seal. Rage tried to climb my throat. I swallowed it, studied the lens, and filmed as the deputy handed each man a citation while the crowd of neighbors whispered into their phones. The bucket stayed grounded. The cabin hummed with power and proof. The gray SUV crept back with its lights low and parked behind cones that meant nothing. A light tower rattled up and threw hard white down the trail. The utility tech raised his palm. Shut it off. Protected scene. The blazer woman stepped into the wash and said community support was present. He flashed his company badge and asked if she wanted to learn how felonies get tallied. The tower died. The cones sagged. He chucked a cable arc in the dirt that matched last night's coil. The supervisor rolled in, read the hinge, seal, chalk, and moss like a receipt, and locked the cabinet with a red tag that said, do not operate. Evidence hold. She read the case number on my copy and told me to film her hands. The deputy arrived as she finished, shook her hand, and faced the agents. Step away from the box and from this porch. He asked for names again. He asked for the chain meant for my gate. They stared at their shoes until steel slid from the SUV floor. He wrote a formal trespass notice, naming my parcel and a short list of prohibited acts that fit the last 2 days like a glove. He read it slow, calm, every phrase paced, and handed copies across the cone line. The blazer woman asked if she could appeal. File your papers in daylight, he said. She asked if she could finish the inspection. That was never an inspection, he said. Neighbors edged closer, drawn by the feeling that a real adult had stepped into the room. The supervisor told me she would file her report tonight and call the prosecutor in the morning. If anyone touches our seal, call dispatch and then call me, she said, sliding her card against my notebook so the camera caught the handoff. Her crew packed slow, listening to the ridge like people measuring weather before they drive. The agents tried to collect dignity and found only cones. They stacked them crooked and slammed the table shut as if noise could glue pride back on. The HOA blazer told the neighbors fear had caused disruption and standards would return. I said, standards begin with law. She hunted for a friendly lens and found none. Engines faded into the draw. I fueled the generator, printed stills, taped the yellow "Do not operate" copy beside my "No inspection" without a warrant sign, and tied a second bell wire under the step. My dog walked the fence with me and never once checked the sky. Old animals learn to read hands, not speeches. I made soup I did not taste and watched the trail camera blink. The deputy texted, "Expect letters. Expect a hearing request. Expect noise." He added, "You kept your cool. Keep doing that." I wrote the minute down so it would stay true in the morning. Later, the generator hiccuped and steadied. I checked fuel with a stick the way my father taught me, then looked at the porch where the camera light winked as if it had seen a shadow fold and unfold. Playback showed a figure dark against the far fence. Not bold, not sure, just testing weather with careful feet. I tried to place the gate and could not. Maybe the driver from the flatbed. Maybe the man who dropped the chain. My dog raised his head but did not give voice. I locked the window and doused the lamp, leaving the house to the soft thrum of the generator and the smaller hum that happens when paper, steel, and patience pull the same direction. I turned toward the stove to bank the coals when a small red dot slid onto the wall, wavered, and settled into a still coin of light that belonged to nobody I know. The red dot held steady on the wall like a cruel wink, then slid a finger's width and stopped above the stovepipe color. I killed the lamp with 2 taps and took a knee below the window line, breath shallow, counting in 4s the way my father taught me when nerves tried to sprint ahead of sense. My dog stayed low at my hip. I texted the deputy. Laser dot on interior wall, generator on, cameras live. Then I listened for the other shoe. A soft whir threaded the cold air. Not wind, not a moth, but the feathered buzz of a drone trying to act quiet. I edged the mirror from behind the chair and tilted it toward the dark glass. A dot jittered across the pane from outside, then held. The mirror caught a pale flicker overhead, a small quadcopter idling above the porch with a laser pointer taped forward. Cute theater. Down by the cellar, the bell wire trembled once, twice, like someone exhaling through their teeth. I crawled to the switch box, counted to 3, and threw the back flood and the siren strobe at the same time. The yard snapped white. The drone flinched, hit the gutter, and burst with a cheap pop. 2 figures at the cellar door froze mid-pry, then split opposite into brush they thought knew their names. I stayed inside, camera up, voice steady as I read, time, gate, trespass, attempt, case number. The lens found a black crowbar on the step and a glove that missed its partner. Tires on the lower bend spun gravel and coughed. Then a beater pickup clawed at the climb and stalled where the road narrows by the alder. One figure dove into brush and vanished. The other limped toward the truck, favoring a knee, then stopped when the flood caught his back. I zoomed and held the frame even when my hands wanted to shake. Plate letters, bumper dents, a cracked tail light haloed by frost. These are names a courtroom respects more than speeches. The deputy texted 2 minutes. I replied with a still of the limp and the plate. My dog gave one low sound and stared left. I pivoted the interior cam toward the cellar gap. The hinge plate showed fresh rub marks, bright, and a pry line scalloped the edge where the old paint gave up. A damp rag lay half crumpled by the sill, darkened with something that had no business near wood. I filmed the stain pattern without breathing, then pulled the frame back so context wouldn't be questioned later. Headlights swung wide from the bend and pinned the pickup in place. The deputy's unit slewed to a stop, nose pointed downhill, boxed the exit, smart and practiced. He stepped out without hurry and leveled his voice at the driver, hands high, engine off. Another unit's wash filled the clearing. The limping man tried a half step and froze when the beam slid up his chest. I stayed on the porch. Cameras rolling, the sirens strobe off now, so the officers owned the light. The blazer woman arrived late with the gray SUV tucked behind a neighbor's fence line like shame hides behind lace. She walked fast, face set to indignant concern, but the deputy cut her short with a palm. Not tonight. He asked the driver to explain possession of a crowbar, a coil of cable, and a rag that smelled like fuel. The driver stammered he was only here to watch. The deputy said he'd get his chance in county. The utility supervisor pulled in behind the second unit, stepped out and pointed at the sealed cabinet. Her voice carried without a shout. Our lock is intact, but someone tried to fake a feed earlier, and we have prints on bagged links. She looked at the rag and wrinkled her nose. The deputy nodded and radioed for fire to check the cellar sill as precaution. The blazer tried again, said, "My generator was a nuisance," and the supervisor smiled like a winter blade. Credit will make it a melody. Neighbors gathered at distance, drawn by sirens and the promise of order. The deputy spread the items on the hood. Crowbar, cutters, spare chain, laser pointer taped with tan wrap, a phone buzzing with a group chat labeled with a tidy acronym that spelled HA board. He photographed each item, then asked the limping man his name. The man tried the old trick of coughing up gravel to buy a second. The deputy waited him out. The second ticked longer than Pride expected. From the road, a courier stepped off a sedan and waved a packet like a man entering the wrong theater by accident. He asked for my name, verified it twice, and passed me a night filing stamped with a bright blue time. An emergency hearing request for a temporary order of control. The blazer's chin tilted a millimeter higher. I read the caption and saw a judge's name I did not know. I took a photo of the cover and sent it to the deputy with 2 words. "Here we go." He told me the morning would be loud but clean. He said he'd sit the hearing if he could and that the supervisor's report would be on the record before dawn. He looked at the pickup and then at the men. He said, "We're done with games. If you return here tonight, you will not like how short the drive feels to county." The limping man stared at the frost steaming from his breath and said nothing. The driver nodded into his collar like an antenna for excuses. The fire unit checked the sill, bagged the rag, and cleared the yard with a quiet efficiency that always makes me breathe deeper. The deputy tore the yellow copy and handed it to me. He said, "Get rest while you can." I tried to smile and failed, then felt my dog lean his full weight against my leg. Steam ghosted from my mouth as the engines faded and the ridge took back its night. I turned to step inside, told the camera good work out of habit, and set the emergency packet beside my notebook. The house felt smaller by a thumb's width. I closed the door, slid the bolt, and let the generator's hum tuck itself into the corners. I told myself the morning would be a fair fight. I almost believed it when the porch glass picked up blue strobes from the bend and new tires chewed the gravel like they had a deadline. I stepped back to the hinge side of the door so it stood between me and whatever speech was about to land. The deputy's hand hovered near his radio, not fear, just a habit that says, "Move first on trouble." The utility supervisor tilted her head the way people do when they recognize a form before they read a line. My dog pressed his shoulder to my shin. The packet on my table felt heavier without moving. I knew enough law to know what late paper can mean. Ex parte, emergency control. The kind of order that tries to freeze a man in his own kitchen while someone else inventories his life. Steam from my breath hung in the wash and fell in crumbs that sparkled against the dark glass. Neighbors leaned from shadowed porches like crows on a fence. The ridge said nothing, which is the way old places show you they are paying attention. I told myself steady. I pictured my father's thumb on a map line and heard him say, "Read the ground, then read the face reading you." The deputy glanced at me once, a small nod that said, "Talk only when it is time to talk." I slid my notebook closer so the camera would catch my hands and not my mouth. I wanted the next frames to say calm, not fight. The woman's shoes clicked on gravel like a metronome set too fast, and the wind carried paper smell, dry and starchy, the scent of rooms that never see sap or rain. The SUV that rolled up war plates I had not seen and a badge I did not recognize. She announced an emergency order and held the paper high so the seal caught my porch light. The deputy asked to see the caption, the basis, the judge's initials. She recited urgency like a hymn. He read the top line twice and said, "This is notice of a morning hearing, not a midnight seizure." "Service accepted," he said, then turned to me and explained, "I was summoned to appear at 9. I slept in pieces and woke before dawn to the generator humming like a watch that refuses to quit. Coffee hissed. My dog nosed the door, then settled by my boots. I photographed the order again, front and back, and tucked it into a folder with the case number written big. The sky moved from iron to ash. Frost lifted off the rail like breath. I left the porch light burning and drove to town with the deputy's card under the visor. The courthouse smelled like old varnish and winter coats. I sat on a bench and marked names as people filed in. The blazer woman arrived with 2 agents and a lawyer who wore his tie like it had been punished. The utility supervisor took a seat behind me and nodded once. The fire lieutenant walked in with a folder the color of storms. The clerk called our case. We stood. I felt that tight pull in the chest that says, "Keep your words short and your spine longer." The judge read the caption and asked for grounds. The board's lawyer started with neighborhood character, then consistency, then safety. He waved photos that looked dramatic until the lieutenant explained how straw had been stacked against my fence by non-authorized hands. He cited his notes and the line that read foreign fuel staged by non-authority removed. The utility supervisor described half-seated blades and bagged links. The judge asked for statutes. The lawyer said harmony. The judge said law. My turn. I kept it plain. I said I live there. I said the board staged a rally in my road, handed out flyers without court seals, attempted to chain my gate, and tried to bill me for hazards they planted. I said machinery scraped my rail. I handed photos. I handed the drone rotor. I handed the company letter about misused letterhead. I moved slow so the record could breathe. The judge read each exhibit with eyes that knew paper tricks. The judge asked the deputy for his report. He summarized trespass warnings, chain recovery, attempted inspection without process, and the late-night drone crash with a taped pointer. He said he observed a light tower aimed at a protected utility scene. He said the supervisor locked the cabinet and tagged evidence. He said the men in the pickup carried a crowbar, cable, and fuel rag. The judge wrote 3 notes that looked like doors closing. The courtroom got very quiet. The motion for emergency control was denied. The judge issued a protective order that barred the HOA board and its agents from entering my parcel, touching my gate, or staging shows on my road. He set a hearing for damages in 30 days. He referred the drone stunt and the utility tamper to the prosecutor. He ordered the board to pay my power credit until the case resolved. He told the lawyer to find real statutes next time or bring comfortable sheets to stand and apologize longer. The blazer woman tried to speak. Her attorney tugged her sleeve. The judge allowed 2 sentences. She said fear had moved her to act. He said fear does not sign orders. He asked her if she understood the plain language of the protective order. She said yes, but it sounded like a word someone had borrowed. The clerk stamped copies and slid me one still warm from the machine. It felt heavier than it weighed. Paper can do that when it finally tells the truth. Outside the courtroom, the supervisor smiled without teeth and said the credit would post today. The lieutenant shook my hand and said he liked how the record read. The deputy said he would drive the ridge at dusk, and that quiet meant something again. The board's lawyer avoided my eye and stared at the floor tile like it might open and swallow embarrassment. The blazer woman walked away fast, but her stumble on the marble step drew phones, and neighbors filmed her silence like testimony. I drove home slow, past the Alder Bend, and saw only snow fence stacked on the flatbed like a failed parade packed for storage. The cones were gone. The banner was missing its heroics. The ridge looked like itself, which is the best look it owns. My porch light still burned. My dog met me at the steps and leaned his weight against my shin like a man who has stopped holding his breath. I set the folder on the table and turned the generator key. The utility truck climbed the grade 20 minutes later. The supervisor cut the red tag, photographed every angle, and restored the feed with a click that sounded like a lock coming home. She wrote the meter reading and handed me a copy with the credit circled. She said, "Keep your cameras anyway." I said, "I will." The house lights warmed from amber to honest white. The stove ticked its approval and settled into a friendly sigh. I walked the fence with a small brush and painted the scrape bright so it wouldn't lie about itself. I set the protective order in a sleeve beside the no inspection sign and taped the judge's initials where a man could see them without squinting. I fixed the drone's broken prop to a nail by the door as a reminder that toys can't carry law. Neighbors drifted by in 1s and 2s. A man who never talked waved and said good morning like he had invented the phrase. A woman left a paper sack of biscuits on the step and whispered, "We like things honest here." I said, "Me too." The elder held a new chime I had hung, and when the wind nudged it, the sound was clean metal, not alarm, just proof that air still moves and lines can sing without meaning harm. The ridge listened and did not disagree. I set one last screw in the cellar hinge and wiped the plate until it shone. I labeled a folder with the case number and slid every photo and copy into order. I pinned the deputy's card to the corkboard and wrote "thank you" across the top in pencil. Late light pooled on the table and turned the protective order gold at the edges. I sat, breathed, and let the quiet build instead of break. I picked up the paper and read the last line twice. "Stay off the property." That was all I ever wanted. Put in words a courtroom understands. I set it down and stepped onto the porch to watch the evening assemble itself without drama. Just pine and frost and a dog who finally dozed without one ear raised. I slid the bolt at dusk and felt the latch kiss home, then pinned the judge's order to the gate beside the trespass code and listened to the back path chime once, soft as a benediction, while the lights inside burned steady on a house that was mine again. And in that quiet, I realized it shouldn't take this much of a fight just to keep what's already yours. Maybe the real lesson here is that neighbors with paper and noise aren't the same as law, and law only matters when you stand your ground. If you've ever had an HOA pull something even half this insane, I need you to tell me about it in the comments below. Let's get your stories out there, unfiltered. This is the kind of fight we cover on this channel. If you want to see more, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss what happens next. If this story hit home for you, that little thanks button below is a great way to support the channel and help us keep telling these stories. That's a wrap from HOA Unfiltered. Guard your home, trust your gut, and keep the lights burning steady.